What is the China model? Is China so special that it must have its own model for governing the country? How does the China model affect China's politics, government, economic, society?
The model refers to a summary of typical features, good practices, experiences in China's process of modernization. You may call this the Chinese approach to development, to modernization.
So the China model as a whole, meaning democracy at the bottom, experimentation in the middle, and meritocracy at the top, is only, I think that is difficult to export as a model.
In today's world, no one would question the extraordinary economic success China has achieved. As China continued its remarkable growth, especially after the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, a new governance model began to emerge. It features a strong state combined with a market economy, constant trial and error experimentation, and an overarching commitment to development. Zhang Weiwei, the renowned political scholar in China, in his own interpretation of the China model, highlights the following elements: pragmatic concern over improving people's standards of living, constant trial and error experimentation, gradual reform rather than economic shock therapy, a strong pro-development state, the selective incorporation of foreign ideas, and a pattern of implementing easy reforms first and difficult ones later.
How did the China model come about, and can it be sustained? What happens as China continues to reform and develop into a fully modernized country? Does the China model evolve? How so? Finally, what is it about the China model that foreigners fear? Let's find out how the China model gets us closer to China. When feudalism and the system of emperors was overthrown in the early 20th century, the claim at that time was made that the old system was very bad and we have to have a new modernization system. In a sense, you're looking back to a time that at least for many decades was rejected by the then ruling entities of China. But you're looking back to that time as justification historically and culturally and civilization for a hyper-modern state.
Yeah. Actually, this lesson from 1911 Republican Revolution was so evident for the next generation of Chinese. We indeed copy the Western model. We have the multi-party system, one person, one vote. All of a sudden, China emerged 300 and more parties. They jogged each other for power rather than for the interests of the most people. In the end, the country ended in civil wars, in what we call warlords fighting each other, and each warlord was supported by some Western powers. So that was a big lesson. But today, China is very different, or totally different from this China of before the 1911 revolution. In the first place, China is arguably the world's largest economy by PPP, purchasing power parity. China wide open. We have China is now the largest trading nation. And furthermore, if you look at the China model, wherever, when China is successful, I call it, it's a 3-in-1 structure. Chinese tradition, socialist elements, and Western elements. You look at this meritocracy. We have a traditional element of the Keju examination. Definitely, people believing someone have to go through certain tests before you can be a leader. And you also have the socialist element. We have the organizational department of the Communist Party. We also have the Western element. I call it a lot of opinion surveys and at different levels, elections. So when you have a 3-in-1, then it's a new type of political system. But you can trace its origin in Chinese civilization. It's inseparable. Otherwise, this model cannot work.
You root your understanding of the China model in Chinese history, particularly in Confucianism. Why are ancient ideas, however laudatory, relevant in a modern contemporary knowledge economy?
Well, not all ideas are relevant, but some of the ideas that are developed in the past are helpful for thinking about how to deal with problems today. For example, one of the issues in China is how to train leaders or how to educate leaders so that they are committed to the public good and not serving their own interests, or in other words, how to make them less corrupt. And to be frank, certain dominant knowledge systems, whether it's liberalism or Marxism, do not have a lot to offer in this respect. But Confucianism has very rich resources for thinking about how to educate leaders so that they're committed to the public good. So if you're thinking about a kind of program for educating leaders, it makes much more sense to draw on Confucianism than on other traditions that have less to offer in that respect. So basically the whole idea of political meritocracy is central to Chinese political culture. And it has a very long history in China, both in terms of arguments over what constitutes merit and also over how to institutionalize merit. And the most famous way of institutionalizing merit is through the examination system, right, which has in Imperial China a 1,300-year history. And basically, through the examinations, they tested different things, including knowledge of Confucian classics, and some of that may still be useful today.
What do you see as the major tensions or contradictions in the China model? What are the areas that give you the biggest concern?
Actually, if you are from a typical prevailing Western view about Chinese political system, then you will see, it's full of contradictions, full of incoherences. How this political system can cope with this dynamism of the society, market economy, it's inconceivable. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a Chinese or civilizational state, then it becomes very coherent and very logical. This kind of country can only be run with this political structure, with this political system. It cannot be otherwise.
Yeah, and the argument that I hear often when I talk about the one-party system is that are you not being, in essence, demeaning the Chinese people by saying they are incapable of participating in a one-person, one-vote election? There's a patronizing element that is from thousands of years of history, the way kings and rulers had a patronizing. Good rulers were very good for the country, but it is a patronizing approach. It says the people in China are not as good as the people in other countries because they can't handle a one-person, one-vote system.
It's a very, very good question, But my own observation, having traveled around the world, having lived in the West for over 20 years, I came with a different perspective. I said we must be very honest with history, with culture, with reality. And I borrowed this idea from Ricardo, the famous economist, comparative advantages. Even in political culture, certain nations can do certain things better than others. I find that with regard to Anglo-Saxon people, they have tremendous power for self-organization, for one person, one vote. In the case of Chinese political culture, we have a tremendous capacity for meritocracy, for examinations, for tests, for pilot projects. So rather than we copy the Western model where we don't have comparative advantage, we emphasize our comparative advantage. And then we also borrow certain elements from the Western model. But it's not the mainstream, but it's secondary. So I said selection first, which is from the Chinese tradition, election secondary, but it's also important. Then, we began to focus on the Western model because after all, it's not the Chinese are in crisis, it's the Western countries in financial crisis, in debt crisis, economic crisis. And so we have to reflect on perhaps something goes wrong in the Western model, including this one person, one vote, which leads to populist politicians making making promises which they cannot fulfill. As a result, all the countries are in debt, you know. And this idea of one person, one vote is based on the assumption that human beings are rational. You can make a rational choice. In the end, we find, especially with the new media, sensational stories, it's increasingly difficult to make rational choices. So we stick to our approach and borrow certain elements from the West, but give play to our relative advantages, comparative advantages. And I always say the two systems can learn from each other.
How do you maintain effective checks and balances?
Well, there's lots of ways of doing it. First of all, I think corruption is the key issue which we recognize, because corruption really means the abuse of public power for private gain, and that's obviously recognized by the leadership in China as a huge problem. So let's put it this way: can we reduce or eliminate corruption without democratic elections? Well, in fact, there's not much evidence that at certain levels of economic development that democracies do better than what we can call meritocracies. You know, I mean, India, Indonesia, and Russia, they all use democratic elections to choose leaders, but those countries arguably are just as corrupt, if not more, than China. But why does China take corruption so seriously? And then I'll try to answer the question of whether corruption can be dealt with without democratic elections. I think it's related to the meritocratic system, because the legitimacy of the leaders is derived partly, if not mainly, by the fact that they're viewed as having superior virtue. If they're corrupt, then by definition it undermines the legitimacy of the leaders. So there's a very strong incentive to deal with corruption in a meritocratic system, which is not true in a democratic system. Because in a democratic system, the leaders get their legitimacy by virtue of being chosen by the people. If the leaders are corrupt, doesn't mean that democracy is not good, right? You just have new elections, change the leaders, and if the leaders are still corrupt, well, maybe something's wrong with the people, you know? But it doesn't mean that democracy is a problem. But in a meritocracy, if the leaders are corrupt, it means there's something wrong with meritocracy. Therefore, the legitimacy of the system is at stake. And that's why the leaders, from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, to Xi Jinping, have all said that that corruption is like a stake in the heart of the whole system. I think they're right about that. So how can you deal with it without democratic elections? Well, there's lots of ways, right? Have more independent supervisory institutions, or more rule of law. Have more have more of a moral education for public servants. I think that's one reason why Confucianism is being revived, as mentioned. Increasing salaries for public officials is hugely important. Have a more clear division between private and public power. I mean, all those ways of dealing with corruption are so important and effective. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say that because there's a very strong incentive to deal with corruption in a meritocratic system, I actually think, and I think there's lots of abuses of the anti-corruption campaign, and people say it's too excessive and it's driven by political biases. I mean, maybe that's all true to a certain extent, but it's changing the way that public officials think and live. And public officials will think twice before taking a bribe or before using a kind of public expense to engage in luxurious practices in a way that wasn't true before. And I'm going to predict that in 10 years' time, that China will be more successful at dealing with corruption compared to democratic countries at similar level of economic development.
Would one test of the China model be if over time the media in China could become more and more free? Because one argument against the China model says that because you have to control the media so tightly in terms of what can be talked about, what can't be talked about, that undermines the credibility of the model as being so good. If it's so good, why can't everybody talk about it in a very open way?
So in terms of freedom of media, there is a huge difference between China and the West. In the West, you have media people, you have intellectuals, you have academias. They criticize their governments, no problem whatsoever. But most of them do not challenge their political system. They believe the system is great, but the government could be bad, Obama could be bad. Yeah. But in the case of China, at least from my observation, many media people, many intellectuals, many academias, they criticize everything, even the traffic incident. They said that's the problem of China's political system. So China, in such a stage of grand transformation, some kind of control of the media is perhaps inevitable, but China should have done much better. Yeah.
So
on the one hand, you allow free discussion, which are everywhere there. On the other hand, should really, at least, stop rumors, as the case I mentioned just now, and to ensure quality discussion. And then come to your idea whether Western media is free or not. And to my mind, we have to use this term perhaps a bit cautiously. For instance, actually in every country there must be some rules and laws to govern. For instance, in France, you can publish these cartoons about this incident. But in the United States, they don't publish this cartoon, so there's some self-censorship. Yeah. Maybe China has not done very well yet, but China exploring this how to run media properly. It's not the best stage yet, but still you cannot underestimate China's great achievements, even in the media. For instance, you have a relatively neutral political force. As a result, you have less, I'm not sure I say this correct or not, sensational stories about certain unnecessary news. And for instance, we give almost equal coverage to the Olympic Games and to the Olympic Games for the disabled people, which is a tremendous boost for the morale of the disabled people. So this kind of balance, it cannot be dictated by the market force, should be channeled by neutral political force. But we can do much better.
Why is it that many people in the West fear the China model? What is it about the China model that makes colleagues of mine nervous?
It may become an alternative to the Western political system. In fact, we should be more open-minded, broad-minded. I always say, it's just like rise of China economically. It provides so many opportunities for other countries, for the West. Same with, I think, with the rise of a political model or political system or new political ideas. I think it's, if we can learn from each other, we're open-minded, that would be great. After all, it's about collective wisdom. We are faced with so many challenges. The United States offers certain wisdom. We can also offer certain wisdom, and then we can share. So those who fear the China model is about this so-called alternative, because their position is we are the best. You should learn from us. And this universal value, universal model, multi-party system, one person, one vote, the best, full stop. But China said, no, no way, no chance. It reminds me of this, you know better than me perhaps, this end of history thesis I mentioned this to Fukuyama. I said, this reminds me of the late 18th century when British Lord Macaulay came to visit China. And he had an audience with Chinese Emperor Qianlong. And Qianlong said, we are the best. And so at that time, that was the Chinese end of history thesis. But China began decline sharply. You know. So I hope the West will not make this kind of mistake and open to new ideas, open to new approaches.
Well, everybody benefits in
Yeah,
the world
that's
by
true.
everybody being raised.
Yeah,
it's
that's
not a zero-sum
Yeah.
game. It's exactly the opposite.
Yeah,
It's
you're right.
it's a summation game, and if one country loses or it falls, then everybody falls in today's world. It's
So there's no need to fear the China model.
okay, well, that's good.
There's this attachment to I think, a dogmatic view that there's only one legitimate way of selecting leaders, and it's one person, one vote. If the system doesn't have that, then other alternatives come to mind. Fascism, Stalinism. But because of this idea of political meritocracy is not so deeply rooted in Western political culture, and because China hasn't made a good case so far of transmitting its views about the importance of political meritocracy, how deeply rooted it is in Chinese history, and how the system is becoming more meritocratic, those views are still not mainstream in Western media especially.
And if it were mainstream, what would that mean?
Well, there would be more respect for a morally legitimate alternative to one person, one vote as a way of selecting leaders. And I think it would be easier to solve problems. You know, that China wouldn't be so defensive and other countries would be more accepting in terms of there's different ways of selecting leaders, and we should allow for that. And some of them are more legitimate.
How sustainable is the China model? We recognize that all different countries have their own historical backgrounds, different structures as we're coming together, but in the modern world with the internet really homogenizing cultures in a very large degree, that over time, are we not all heading towards the same kind of ultimate systems that are optimized for whatever the situation is at the time, rather than relying on old ways of thinking?
Well, I'm not sure that cultures are being homogenized, and I'm even less sure they're being homogenized towards a kind of Western view of, you know, this is the right way to organize politics. In fact, you can argue that there's been this revival of tradition, not just in China, but in many other countries over the past 20 or 30 years, during the same time that the world is supposedly becoming more homogenized. That said, I think there's three key obstacles to political meritocracy that China needs to overcome in order for it to be sustainable. And the first is, if the leaders are not subject to the people's vote, then how do you check their power? I think there are many ways of checking power besides democratic elections, but that part has to be developed. The two is how to ensure that the system doesn't ossify, how to ensure that there's different avenues and giving different ways of people to enter the political elite. That's a very important issue. And the third issue is how to make the system legitimate to people without there being consent as a fundamental basis of the system. I think there are ways to answer those issues, but those issues need to be answered for the system to be sustainable.
For the China model to continue to develop into what is important for the Chinese people in the future, what are the primary obstacles? What are the tensions, contradictions, as you honestly look at it from a Chinese point of view?
Actually, from a Chinese point of view, at least at this particular stage, you know, I think it's a lack of confidence in the China model. Why? At this particular moment, at least over the past decade, I feel that there's strong tendency in the Western media as well, and many Chinese, especially in the academia, you know, strongly influenced by the Western idea that U.S. model represents the best model. China model will not work. So as a result, many intellectuals are not self-confident. So I think this is a major threat. Number two, of course, is China's own problems. We do have many problems. You know, issue of corruption, gap between rich and poor, and regional gaps, environmental degradation. But I always say, we have problems, but also we have solutions. Yeah, and the China model offers solutions, even in terms of environmental degradation. Up to 4 years ago, people say, China was just polluting the world. Maybe it's still the case today, but if you look at the figures, China is now the largest investor in renewable energy, in electric cars, in wind and solar energy, etc. So I said, with China model, at least there is one feature, that is, if we really recognize a mistake we have made, we try to correct it seriously, and the way we correct our mistakes perhaps is more efficient than other models.
Looking at the China model as a sustainable model, as China develops, and as you know, the goal for the leadership of the country is by sometime mid-century to be a fully modernized nation, as Europe may be today. It's a long process. Maybe by 2050, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, which would be 2049. Would the China model still be applicable in that type of an environment, with the whole country is effectively at the economic development of Central Europe?
I don't see why not. I mean, there's no good argument for thinking that, what's the alternative, right? The alternative is a kind of one-size-fits-all solution that no matter what level of government, whether it's a small community of 100 people or a big country, 1.3 billion people, there's only one way of selecting leaders, one person, one vote. If that's the alternative, then I think that's kind of ridiculous. It doesn't help to solve problems, and it doesn't fit with China's history. So what is the alternative? I don't think there's a good alternative on the horizon. So I think that the model should be increasingly perfected in the future, rather than thinking that there's some sort of, what are the alternatives? Military dictatorship, fascism, one person, one vote at all levels of government. I think they're all deeply flawed models.
What will it take for China's government to sustain the China model? It must continue to deliver tangible results to the Chinese people. First is economic development. High employment, low inflation, increased consumption. Second is higher quality of life, a cleaner environment, smaller disparities, social mobility, equality in social services, especially healthcare and education. Third is national pride, as China retakes its place among the leading nations of the world. Fourth is governmental transparency and various freedoms. Both must increase over time as the country modernizes. What will it take for foreigners to appreciate the China model? This is a larger topic, but such appreciation can develop only with a kind of convergence, where China's political system continues to reform with increasing transparency and freedoms, and where foreigners come to understand that for governing China's complex society, the pragmatism of a political meritocracy trumps, at least for now, the idealism of a multi-party democracy. The China model can contribute to the world marketplace of ideas. I can attest to the high quality in general of China's leaders. The West can learn from China how to select, train, and develop outstanding public officials. But what works today may not tomorrow. Vigilance is constant, and reform is forever. Following the China model keeps us closer to China.